Fed meeting, stress tests Friday, BOJ, any of these could disappoint.
Absolutely, yeah, and you know, there's always event risk, isn't there? You know, that's the first thing to point out. And I think one of the ways that we'd read the stress tests in a way is that that could be potentially one of the positive upshots from the UK's vote to exit the EU, is that that seems to have galvanised policymakers on the continent to actually try and, or at least recognise some of the problems facing the European banking sector and maybe come to some kind of workaround in terms of something that's within the, you know, the BRRD, but something that does help that Italian banking sector to start dealing with that non-performing loan situation, and at the same time helping, you know, I think none of the policymakers in Europe are really going to want to be dealing with the opposition options in Italy, and so they probably do want to be dealing with Renzi, and that's probably incentivizing them to make the background as helpful as possible for that, you know, that autumn referendum in Italy.
Can we just close our eyes to the problem in Italy, though? I mean, it strikes me that there's still an element of denial here. When you listen to the comments from the central bank governor over the weekend, it's like there's nothing really to see here. There's no systemic crisis in the Italian banking system.
I don't think
he might be right, of course.
I mean, I don't think there's a systemic crisis necessarily. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be sorted, but it's going to take more than you know, a little bit of recapitalization to sort, in a sense. I think depends what you call systemic, really, doesn't it? But I think that the important thing about the October-November referendum is that it needs to allow Renzi to pursue civil justice reform. I mean, one of the big problems you have in Italy is just the way that bad debts are dealt with. The courts just take too long. You know, it takes, you know, there's some civil justice cases still standing from the early 90s. So that's not an environment in which, you know, bad debt investors are going to be picking up debt off other people's books or dealing with it.
What advice are you giving to the clients at the moment about where you might find some value or some short-term opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, developed equities still feel to be the most plausible place to take risk for us. We also recommend some high yield in Europe and the US. You know, taking some credit risk feels like the way. If inflation is unevenly returning in the US economy, and that does feel like it is, then, you know, in order to get paid in real terms, you've got to take some credit risk. You know, if the 10-year yield is at, you know, 1.5%, that's not going to, you know, cover you in inflation terms, especially with, you know, core CPI is now above 2%. With developed equities, I think the interesting thing is that the valuation debate, you know, it's very subjective always, isn't it? You know, what time frame do you compare today's valuations against? Is it the last 10 years, which is going to be warped by the, you know, great financial crisis, the biggest profits fall on record? Is it, you know, 30, 40 years when you start including the 70s, the worst period, you know, single-digit Ps throughout that whole period? Or do we go back 100 years and totally lose any relevance in terms of accounting standards or index composition? You know, why do we want to compare the index of today with 12 railroad companies? So the problem is that, you know, how do you sort of, you know, history contains no precise answers in valuation, and for us, the thing to look at probably is dividend yield. You look at FTSE, 4% dividend yield, you know, versus the gilt, for instance, less than 1%. Now I have to take a very pessimistic view on how those corporates are going to grow those dividends over the next 10 years to not to want to own stocks in large proportion. For the US, you can include the net buyback and you get 4.5%-ish, plus some growth over the next low single digit, mid single digit, you know, growth of that dividend and pipe buyback. Those are decent returns over the next few years.